Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with American singer, songwriter, musician David Rovics, who's also getting ready to go to Australia for a tour here at the end of the month. And well, welcome. Hi, David.
Thanks, Layne. Good to see you.
Today, I wanted to talk to you about the Nordic model because of course, you play there quite often to take a lot of time there in Northern Europe. And there's some significant things that have gone on there over the past century for how people and government work together. I thought that was really interesting. I've seen some of your essays on this.
Hmm.
Let me first start off with a question. What is this Nordic model that people talk about?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the Nordic countries, and I just read George Lakey's book, Viking Economics, as you know, and I thought it was a great book. But so I mean, but what is the Nordic model? I guess the Lakey, first of all, differentiates the Nordic model from the welfare state because I mean one of the things he explains in the book is the concept of the welfare state as it is practiced in some countries tends to be like a question of government aid to the poor or the less well off in society, you know, and whereas in Scandinavia, as in some other countries, you know, the practice is more about having a having institutions that everybody benefits from that serve the entire society that are not just for anybody who's struggling, you know, but it's more like creating a model that allows for the entire society to prosper and to have equal access or roughly equal access to things like universal free education, higher education, healthcare, housing, you know, stuff like that. So that, I mean, that's, I guess, in a nutshell, I'd say that's the Nordic model is a social, effective, functioning social democracy that provides for everyone's, basic needs and more than that, really. But that's the basis of it, I guess.
Yeah, for clarifying terms, because people listening will sometimes sometimes they general populace has different concepts that are not actually clear. So like if you have something like socialism, which is the workers controlling production, their own work, and you have social democracy, which is actually a capitalist system, people sometimes confuse these. So you're saying there's capitalism in the Nordic model, but it's better distributed. People have
Well,
access.
I mean, I'd say that these terms like socialism, capitalism, social democracy are all very problematic terms because
Mhm.
they they all need to be defined anytime we're using them, not just with lay people who don't talk about economics all the time, but just with anybody. Because, like, I mean, you know, the French Socialist Party calls itself socialist, and the Soviet Union called itself socialist, and Cuba calls itself socialist, and these are all radically different places with
North
radically
North
different
Korea
societies.
North Korea is
North Korea
Democratic
calls itself
Republic.
socialist. Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, we can all throw around words and but what do they really mean? What is capitalism? I mean, where is a country that practices, unfettered capitalism, whatever that is? I don't know what that is, you know, because all countries that I know of have governments, and the governments do stuff like they facilitate capitalist enterprise, or they regulate capitalist enterprise, or they do some combination thereof. Either way,
Mhm.
that's not unregulated, you know, unfettered capitalism. It may be crony corruption like what we have in the United States, but it's still a government. So it's not, sort of pure capitalism, which is just a figment of some economist's imagination anyway. It doesn't exist and it never has. But I mean, with socialism, it's the same kind of uh, situation in terms of like what is it, where is it practiced, with any kind of like purity or whatever. I mean, it's just a concept, and there's always countries with everywhere always has had some combination of businesses and governments as part of what's going on for the past few centuries, right? There's been businesses and there's been governments, but there's also been lots of other institutions that we rarely talk about that have played such a huge role in the development of the Scandinavian model, as George Lakey, really talks about a lot in his book, like about the power, like the cooperatives and what role workers cooperatives and farmers cooperatives and all kinds of other cooperatives have played in the building of a prosperous society and the building of institutions that maintain that prosperity, that are not necessarily dependent on whoever's in office at the time, because these cooperatives people actually, there's in so many cases people cooperatively own, their neighborhoods and their buildings, and these kinds of situations are, it's possible to undo it and to create a nightmare out of a dream, but the institutions that make Scandinavia what it is are not just a matter of who's in power in the government at the time. The government is only playing one part of the picture. And it's interesting. One of the things that he notes that's also interesting, that I only just learned from reading the book, is that the cooperative movement became very powerful before the Social Democrats actually were running the countries. And that process of the political sort of arm of this cooperative movement coming to political power after the cooperatives were already very strong in society and really providing a lot of prosperity for a lot of society already, that was a important sort of part of the process in creating what we call the Scandinavian model, and creating a sort of some kind of a faith that a lot of people have there in the model, which differs from what happened in Germany, which I think is especially relevant to our reality today, and why the Scandinavian model is so relevant to people today. Because what happened in Germany was the Social Democrats came to power without having the kind of base in society that the Social Democrats had in Scandinavia, and then the Social Democrats could be blamed for all the failures of the German government in failing to provide for the people in the wake of World War I and the everything that was going on with the Depression and the Vichy. The Treaty of Versailles and everything else that was causing poverty and misery for the German people. That they were able to, the fascists were able to scapegoat the idea of social democrats and social democracy and offer what a lot of people bought as a alternative. And the people who were buying this alternative were people who were truly suffering, whereas the fascist alternative never really took root in Scandinavia, except under Nazi occupation in Norway, where, of course, but even in that, as Lakey documents, even in that situation, there was still a lot of the basic sort of fascist institutions and notions of how society could be, never really took root in Norway the way they took root in other places, because the whole cooperative movement and the notions of social democracy were still so strong there. Although, so it was, whereas fascism was and is now today a tremendously popular ideology in many parts of the world, and it's really undergoing a serious resurgence in many different countries in Eastern Europe and the United States, in recently in Brazil, certainly very much right now in Israel. Fascism in various iterations is having a massive resurgence in popularity in much of the world and in India. And it's very clear why this is happening. And it's happening for the same reasons that it happened before, 90 years ago in Germany. And it's to do with the failure of socialism and social democracy to offer prosperity for the working class and the majority of the population in a given country. In where socialists or social democrats or cooperatives or some combination thereof have been able to offer, or create a functional, prosperous, happy society as they have achieved in all of Scandinavia, then fascism never gets popular. Although it should be said that certainly there's a lot of bad ideas that are popular in Scandinavia, and there's a lot of and as Lakey mentions, there's definitely right-wing parties that get significant amounts of the vote, but it's also the case that these right-wing parties are not right-wing the way that we would define right-wing in the United States. I mean, they're not economically libertarian. They don't believe in low taxation. They don't believe in privatizing, the educational system or whatever, privatizing the trains. I mean, there's these tendencies exist, and they exist on the right, and they exist among the social democrats. These kind of ideas about privatization and following the American model, and lots of mistakes in that direction have been made in lots of different Scandinavian countries over time. But the general gist of things is to have all to create a prosperous society through the means of well run government institutions and working with unions and cooperatives and businesses, and it's to do things very differently. And where this happens, like in Scandinavia, the fascists, the right wing is xenophobic. It's not, and that's as we can all of us who are against xenophobia, can agree, xenophobia sucks, and it's bad, and it's a real problem. And and there's a lot of things we could say about why that exists in Scandinavia, why the right wing parties do exist, and why they get votes the way they do. But they don't get the votes for the same reason that right wing parties get votes in other countries. It's not that people are looking for some way to become prosperous. They're already prosperous. The right wing is attractive for other reasons. Perhaps partly because of a decline in prosperity, and then whenever there's any kind of decline in prosperity, that's an opportunity for the right wing to jump on that. But even with some decline in prosperity, the right wing is not offering as an alternative on a widespread basis that like a totally different kind of model, like getting rid of free healthcare and education. They're just talking about closing the borders. I mean, that's where they're at. That's where the right wing is at in Scandinavia, and that's very evident. And they there's a lot of people in Scandinavian society who are not right wingers, who don't vote for the right wing, who still understand the why there's a lot of people voting for the right wing. There is also a lot of I mean, they would never call it pride, because pride is a terrible thing for Scandinavians. They're all very humble people, and they embrace, all kinds of notions of, being humble and not sticking out. And in that way, it's a lot of similarities between them and the Japanese, I think, in this group-oriented kind of way. Like they're not into standing out and being heroic or being a villain. That just everybody should get along. That's a real big important motif in Scandinavian society, but there is a real pride in the culture of social democracy, or in the what they think of as their culture. I mean, and lots of Scandinavians recognize that the idea that everybody getting along and prosperity and taking care of each other and high taxes and all this, that this is not always been how Scandinavia is. It was a very different place, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and not to say nothing of 1,000 years ago, very different place. And there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of bloodshed, and a lot of empire building in the past, and 400 years of warfare between Denmark and Sweden. I mean, there's a lot of water under the bridge, but what the Scandinavians think of as Scandinavian culture and Scandinavian society today is something that a lot of Scandinavians are very proud of. And so there is definitely a lot of the widespread resentment of anybody who just doesn't want to, assimilate. I mean, it's a culture that was imposed upon itself. It's not like that Scandinavians have always been good, loving parents raising their children so well. That's not been the case in Scandinavia for more than 3 generations. It was a very Germanic. I mean, it was very, parenting was for a long time very strict. Beating children was very normal. I mean, this was, it was not the society that it is now, 150 years ago, but it has become a place where, people raise their kids so well. And when they see, anybody coming from another country who yells at their children, they want them to learn to not do that, and then and they resent having people around who aren't doing things the way the Scandinavian way, because they think it's better.
Let me jump in. So this happened over the past 150 years, and during that time, when a lot of the good things, I would call them good things, happened, is the Soviet Union was on one side there with Finland, and there's a northern border with Sweden, Norway, I think, at the top, and then you had Germany and the rest of Europe, UK, and right there with Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and then Finland also has the Nordic model, right? So the Scandinavian countries don't include Finland, but the Nordic model is just that kind of Northern European model. And you were also talking
people would include Finland. I mean, Finland. There's different definitions of what's Scandinavia, I guess, but in terms of like the Nordic model, Finland is definitely part of it.
Yes. Yeah, but they're not Scandinavia. Finland. So the Nordic model covers that whole region up there.
Right.
And you said that when the changes started to happen in Germany, there was some of this in Germany, but it didn't have this foundation. And I think that this is really interesting. Of course, for people that are listening in, David's discussing the book by George Lakey called Viking Economics. Okay, so I think we have kind of an idea of what the Nordic model is, the good and the bad, the history and so forth. There's one thing that you mentioned here right at the end, and you started to get into the family. Can we talk a little bit about this? Because these days, and maybe a lot through history, but these days people are really under a lot of stress, trying to take care of children, healthcare, And for example, in South Korea, women are there's actually a movement. It's like in the government that women are not having children; they refuse. So when I read about the Nordic model, and I hear you talking, can you talk about this a little bit? It's far different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's they have a high fertility rate, a high birth rate, and they have generally still the world's. I mean, even though there's been decline and higher costs than it used to be, but basically they have one of the world's best systems for daycares and preschools and education schools generally that are well funded, resourced with great folks. I mean, I'm a little hesitant to speak so glowingly of Scandinavia, because I know that if there's any Scandinavians watching, they're going to be like, really annoyed with what I'm talking about, because they're all involved with fighting against reforms, capitalist, free market types of reforms to so many of these institutions. But so and I'm totally in solidarity with them. So I just have to say that. But the fact is, they live in paradise compared to most of the world, and they just have to deal with me saying that. And because I'm not the only one who says that. I'm just one of many, many people who go there who say, "Oh my goodness, we need to be like this."
Let me add in some statistics here then for your friends that will be rolling their eyes at you. In 2015, there's a Save the Children, which ranks all the world's countries for the best place to be a mother. So in 2015, the top five were Norway, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden. That's the entire Nordic region. The UK was
Yeah,
24th, and the United States
yeah,
33rd. So okay, so yeah, there's difficulties, there's struggles, uh, but let's get into this a little bit. So you say you go to the park and you see fathers out there. Most of the time the father would be working in the kind of old model. Why is this?
yeah. So you have paternity leave. I mean, first of all, the average worker in Scandinavia, 1 or 2 months paid vacation is very normal, and it is not unusual to get more than 2 months paid vacation. And this is just for workers across the board. And then, so that's even without paternity or maternity leave. But then, if you have a kid, then I don't know, it depends on the country how long. I don't know the exact numbers, but you have many, many months, 6 months, a year, something like that. And oftentimes, you can divide that time however you want to between the mother and the father. So and so fathers can be very actively involved with raising their children from birth. And then the work week is very short. So, compared to much of the world, people are working, less than 40 hours a week generally. So they have free time. In addition, not counting the paid vacation and the maternity and paternity leave, they, even without all that, they still have lots of free time to be with their kids because the work week is so short. Mm-hmm. So, that's, and then because of anybody who's seen Michael Moore's movie Where to Invade Next has already, it's a great movie because it's very funny, but you get a lot of little examples of so many of the great ideas that have come out of sort of like communally run schools and other institutions that often originated in the United States, but were adopted and institutionalized on a widespread basis in Scandinavia. So like the boarding school, folk school, kind of whatever you call it, movement that used to be a big thing in the US and in other countries as a sort of a left-wing sort of practice, left-wing summer camps. And, but these kinds of institutions have been adopted and spread on such a wider basis. So now, like in Denmark and Sweden, the folk school movement is pretty much like everybody knows about them, and many people go to these schools, and they're transformational to kids. I mean, I've never seen such academically inclined and sort of engaged young people than I've seen in Denmark. Never anywhere.
That's an interesting point, that a lot of the innovations that we see in other countries that we might admire if we know about them actually come from the United States. Take, for example, we'll get back to the family in a moment, but the European Enlightenment. Democracy was not something popular, wasn't even really talked about in Europe until they had contact with the Eastern region of the United States, the woodland Native Americans, the Hopewell, the Hopewell were much before that, but the Iroquois Nation, the Wendat, Huron, and so forth. But so that it's actually kind of interesting the role that the United States has played in the modern world, because it is a global hegemon. But at the same time, you hear, I wouldn't even call it leftist. I just call it like these communal type foundational aspects of society we see in this model you're discussing.
Yeah, I mean, and democracy is another example. I mean, the U.S. It certainly was not the first or the oldest democracy, and depending on how these things are defined, the people who like to define the U.S. as that way are the ones who like to pretend that constitutional monarchy, like they had in England, was not democratic. And I would argue that it was at least as democratic as the pseudo democracy that we have had in the United States since 1780, whatever. But it is certainly U.S. democracy is one of the older forms of democracy in the modern world in terms of industrialized countries, and but most of the European countries that developed democratic institutions, parliaments, and stuff like that, like several decades after the United States did a much better job of it. I mean, the parliamentary systems in the countries in Europe that have had parliamentary systems often since like 1849, have much better parliamentary systems and than we have in the US, and also better than the UK has. And of
Okay, so
course they also had the benefit of these uprisings in 1848 that nearly, that overthrew every monarchy in Europe except for England and Russia. And so, there was a lot at stake for the monarchs and for the powerful to make compromises with these massive movements of the working class and middle class, that we might call them today, that were rising up all over Europe. But what ended up after that, including in places like Denmark, was much more functional parliamentary systems than we have in the U.S.
going back to the kind of how the functional aspect, everyday part is. I heard you say paternity leave and maternity leave, and in Lakey's book, he says, I think it's something like 46 weeks maternity leave or paternity leave with 100% of your pay, or 56 weeks, a little more than a year, with 80% of your pay. And then you can go back to your job where you were at. Of course, they have one of the criticisms of this, I think, would be, well, what about like a surgeon or someone who has high skills? Then they've lost that time. But they have, of course, training, for people to get back up on their skills and so forth. It's quite phenomenal. So if you had this, you could eat. I would think logically have a healthier family.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So with this kind of
Mhm.
thing, you have universal health care. You have this kind of support. How about innovation? What are your thoughts on enterprising and business within this model?
I mean, this is also like one of those things that I don't remember the statistics offhand, but Denmark is one of the biggest producers per capita of patents and copyrights and technology and IT startups, and and also the government is very involved with fostering all of that, just as the government has been very involved with fostering Danish agriculture and trade with other countries and all the kinds of things that are uh, good for farmers and good for there's a lot of government involvement with helping industries, but definitely that has resulted in lots of innovation and lots of entrepreneurs coming out of places like Denmark. And in terms of like what the government has done in terms of like the schools in Sweden, another example in terms of innovation is uh, Sweden per capita produces more pop hits than any other country in the world in English. And this is because they have music in the schools, and from a very early age children learn how to sing, they learn how to read music, they sing in choirs together, so they learn harmonies, and so they're getting the foundation for being professional musicians, and as a result they produce more pop hits than anywhere else in the world. And that's just, I mean, people in the music business, people like to imagine that the people who become successful musicians are, or top of the charts or whatever, that there's some kind of inherent brilliance or talent. And I mean, certainly there's talent involved, and there's lots of very talented musicians at the top of the charts all over the world. But the it's a systematic thing. You can teach people to become good musicians, and by doing that, you increase. Obviously, statistically, it's clear, from the Swedish example, that you do that and you increase the chances of creating of more of those brilliant, talented pop stars. Existing in the first place, because just like you provide people with easy access to tennis courts year round, then that doesn't necessarily mean you're automatically going to produce the next Bjorn, whatever. But certainly you're not going to produce. You're very unlikely to produce them if without the tennis court access year round. So they just provide the infrastructure. They provide the setting for people to really prosper. And of course, there's much more social mobility in Scandinavia than there is in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. We can end up here on music with your tour. You're headed to Australia, which also has some social democratic things in place. In fact, I think it's number one in healthcare for a
Yes.
long time. What are you planning to do there?
Be doing gigs between Brisbane and Ballarat, basically, which the Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, and Ballarat and Melbourne. So yeah, a bunch of gigs in different places on the east coast of Australia. And yeah, Australia has quite a history that of working class struggle and to some extent, at least historically, working class prosperity. I mean, especially early on with the Eureka Stockade in 1854, the rebellion that really sort of shaped Australian history after that in a big way. And Australia was the first country to win the 8-hour day, because of that rebellion. Yeah, and they got, out of this rebellion, they reformed the land laws. There was a lot of, and of course, the Homestead Act in the U.S. was also a result of farmer rebellion. But they had a similar history in Australia with people getting access to land and the vote, and of course by people. Yeah, let's qualify that. We're not talking about the indigenous people who were and are extremely marginalized and in so many ways in Australia, but the white settler majority got lots of rights as a result of their struggles on the in the mines and elsewhere in Australia in the early days of when they still had when they only had a few million people in the whole country, like in the late 19th century.
Well, it sounds like it'll be an interesting trip. Melbourne sounds nice. I've never been there. Ocean City.
Melbourne
David,
is nice. There's outside of Asia, if you're looking to eat food with the most widest selection of Asian restaurants you've ever seen outside of Asia, I'd say Melbourne. Melbourne is Adelaide too. They're amazing. Australia is a much more diverse place than it used to be too. That's there. People who know Australian history know about the very long period of the whites-only immigration policy, but that ended several decades ago. So with Gough Whitlam in the 70s. So it is a very diverse society as well, and Melbourne's a nice place for a lot of reasons. But one of the best things about it is the food.
Well, I've been talking here with David Rovics, the American singer, songwriter, musician, and have a good time in Australia. Take care.
Thank you. Good talking to you, Layne.